Good morning. As we begin this week, I would like to draw our attention to this question. So here it is, and I would like for you to write it down and to remember it, to think about it, not just today, but think about it today and throughout this week. So here is our question for the week. And the question is, does this describe me? Does this describe me? Now, there might be some other questions to go with that question, like, well, if this does not describe me, then why not? The other question maybe to ask with it is, well, if this does describe me, then how do I know? And maybe another question to ask is, if this does describe me, what's the point? What's the result? What's the consequence of this describing me? So again, our big question is, does this describe me? And there are some other questions to think about, like, if not, why not? And if so, how do I know? And if so, what's the result? What's the point? So you might be wondering, well, what are you talking about? Well, for that, I want us to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 6. So grab your Bibles, turn there, I'll read, and then we can talk. 1 Corinthians 13, 6. Here we go. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Again, our big question is, does this describe me? Now, that one verse is a little vague, right? I bet most of us, if not all of us, know exactly what that verse is talking about. And we probably have heard it 100 times. So, but we're asking, does it describe me? And as we first look at that verse, what do we need to know? What is it? And notice in that verse it says, it rejoices. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices with the truth. So what is it? Well, for that, let's read some other verses around it. Start with verse 4, and here we go. You know it. Verse 4 begins, love is patient and kind. Let me tell you something. This is pretty neat. See that word kind? That word kind in the Greek language. So 1 Corinthians 13 was originally written in Greek. The Greek word for that word kind is spelled Chrestos. Christos. Well, the Greek word for Christ is spelled this way, Christos. Christos. And so often, when this verse would be read back 2,000 years ago, and they would talk about love, some misheard it and would take it this way, that love is Christos, love is Christ. And I thought, how neat is that? That when you look at the life of Christ, when you see him interact with people, don't you walk away thinking, wow, how he loved others. So I think it's fitting when we read this and think love is kind, that at first people got confused and thought love was talking about Jesus. And I think that's part of the point. Love does talk about Jesus. He was loving. And wow, how he loved. Let's get back to it. Verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It, right, talking about love, does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. And here's our verse to think about. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Verse 13, isn't it interesting that 1 Corinthians 13 has 13 verses? So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And let's just read the first couple words of chapter 14. What's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 13? Well, you read it here at the beginning of chapter 14. Pursue love. Now, we began this with a question. Does this describe me? And I think that's a great question to ask after reading chapter 13, or at least most of it. Does this describe me? Now, why would we be asking this question? I think let's just follow it up with another question. Why is this chapter in the Bible? Well, there's two answers to that question. Why is 1 Corinthians 13 in the Bible? Well, here's the first answer. It's not so we have something to read at weddings. I mean, think about most often where you hear this chapter read, or when. I think more often than not, we hear this chapter read at weddings. Well, this chapter is in the Bible, not so much so we have something to read at weddings. And you may have heard people take this chapter and suggest, take out the word love and put your name. I've heard that suggested when people are dating and thinking about marrying the person they're dating, that it's been suggested, why don't you put that person's name in for the word for love, and at the end say, does that really describe that person? Well, that's kind of not the point. It's not a chapter to be used so we have something to read at weddings, and it's not so much a chapter to be used when we're dating another individual. Although I understand that, and doesn't it kind of make sense when you're considering spending the rest of your life with someone to look at 1 Corinthians 13 and ask, well, does that describe that person? So that's good. I'm not belittling that. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying that's not the entire point. But I think part of the point is to go ahead and put your name in there. And not when you're considering marrying another individual. There's something as important at stake. Why is this chapter in the Bible? Well, here's the second part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, where is it in the Bible? 1 Corinthians 13, this chapter is in a letter written to a local church called the Church at Corinth. And as you begin this letter written to the church at Corinth, what do you find out? It's right there at the beginning. This church, this local church, has a ton of problems. Right there in the first chapter, Paul gives us some insight as to why he's writing. And a reason he is writing is that he has found out, he has been told, there are some serious problems at this church, at this local church. And the word that he uses is divisions. And I always laugh now in reading this, and I love sharing it. Someone told him that there's problems at this local church, and the someone is a person named Chloe. Now, my oldest daughter, her name is Chloe. And I love, in reading that verse, I always think about my daughter. And I kind of pray that she'll live up to her name. Because I think this is true of the Chloe in the Corinthian church. I don't think she was a tattletale. I think she wanted to help her local church. And I think she wanted to help her local church because she loved her local church. Now, what does it mean to love your local church? It does not mean to love the building. It does not mean to love the history of your church. Get a little bit more specific. Church is people. And so when you say, I want to help my local church, I love my local church, do you know what you're saying? You're saying, I love the people. Now get a little bit more specific. Put a name in there for people. When you say I love my church, you're saying you love every single person in that local church. When you say, I want to help my local church, you're saying, I want to be a help to every single person in that local church. I think that describes Chloe in this Corinthian church. And so she reaches out to Paul and says, Paul, we got trouble. We got problems. And so he writes this letter. And as the letter unfolds, he keeps subtly, and then he gets even more specific, addressing the problems going on in this local church. And so why do we have this chapter in the Bible? Well, it's for that reason. But I want you to think of 1 Corinthians 13 as part of a group. It's part of a group of chapters in this letter, and it's written to be a help to the local church. And it's part of a trio of chapters that starts with 1 Corinthians 11. Now, you can read it later, but the theme of 1 Corinthians 11 is this: how we treat one another. And when I say how we treat one another, I mean within our local church. 1 Corinthians 11 is written about how we are to treat one another. How is this local church treating one another? Very poorly. To the point where Paul says to them, it would be better if you did not even meet. He says you actually meet for the worse. You don't meet for the better. But the solution is never to stop meeting. The solution is get it right. And that's why Paul's writing. So 1 Corinthians 11 is about how we treat one another. Then he moves into chapter 12. And the theme of chapter 12 is this: we need one another. Now, why do we need one another? According to 1 Corinthians 12, it's because each one of us has a special part in the local church, that without one another, the local church is not going to work properly. And there's a reason that the local church must work properly. Now, think for a second. What is that reason? Okay, so you have 1 Corinthians 11, right? How we treat one another. 1 Corinthians 12, we need one another. Why is that? And then 1 Corinthians 13, what is 1 Corinthians 13 all about? Love. And then the conclusion is, the start of chapter 14, pursue love. So what is, when you think about the context, what is 1 Corinthians 13 about? Why is it in the Bible? Could it be this? If you stick with the theme, if you stick with what Paul is developing, that what is really important in our treatment of one another, what is really important in needing one another, what is really important to dissolve the problems, is that we pursue love with one another. It is that we pursue love, loving one another. Does that make a little bit of sense? Now, why is that so important? Why is it so important that we pursue love, loving one another within, first, our local church? Well, Jesus said something like this, and I believe it was on that Thursday night before he went to the cross. He told his disciples, the world's going to know you belong to me by how you love one another. So I want to put it like this. I wrote it down this morning, and I thought, well, what's the whole point of this? And it's just something for us to chew on, to think about. What is so important about 1 Corinthians 13? And it comes back to that question we started off with. Does this describe me? And if not, why not? And if so, how do I know? And if so, why is this so important? Why is it so important that this describes me and how I love Calvary Community Church and how I love other Christians and why is this so important that it does describe me? Because that's part of the point. It is to describe you. It is to describe me. It is to describe Christians. Well, for what purpose? Here it is. This is what I wrote down early this morning. What's the point? I think you can put it in different ways, but this is how I've been thinking. What's the point of doing 1 Corinthians 13? Well, one, an effective local church that loves like this is showing that it is affected by the gospel. This fits with what Jesus said, that the world will know that you belong to me by how you love one another. Well, in loving one another, kind of the result is that we be an effective local church. And an effective local church is a church that is affected by the gospel. Well, what does this mean? This means that lives get changed. When we love like this, we are demonstrating that we are a life that got changed. How so? By the power of the gospel. That kind of fits like Romans 1, right? The power of the gospel. That Paul said he was very eager to go preach to the Christians in Rome. So to love like this means we are an effective church that has been affected by the gospel, which means lives get changed. It means our lives got changed, but it also means this is how lives get changed. Again, what did Jesus say? They'll know that you belong to me by how you love one another. Meaning there's an appeal here to those who are on the outside, to those who are unchurched, that this is what supernatural love does to a person. And why do we love like this? Because God first loved us like this. So it means lives get changed. But it doesn't end there. The ultimate purpose is this. It means that we get to show off the greatness of God. How so? Well, John 3:16 comes to mind. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Do you see the point? It shows off the greatness of God. So I want to ask that you join me in starting off our week like this. Does this describe me? And what's at stake in 1 Corinthians 13 describing me like this? What's at stake? Well, the effectiveness of our local church is at stake. Changed lives are at stake. And ultimately, this is our purpose. What is at stake is that we get the opportunity to show off the greatness of God.